Welcome, everyone. My name is Layla Durstein. I have the pleasure of heading up alumni engagement programs here at Williams College, and we're delighted to bring you our third Alumni Winter Study program, which is actually part of our third annual Alumni Winter Study series. So in January of 2021, we organized an inaugural Alumni Winter Study in celebration of the Williams Society of Alumni Bicentennial. And as you may know or may have heard through that programming, our society is the oldest alumni association in North America and quite possibly the world. We are united in our shared commitment to a liberal arts education, to lifelong learning, and most especially to one another. A few reminders before we get started today. If you have any questions during the talk, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can do that at any time. We will have dedicated time for Q&A toward the end of the program, but you can submit your questions as you think of them. Please do reserve the chat as a space to engage with the community, share any reflections or comments you may have. You'll want to remember to select everyone in the chat dropdown so that your message can be seen by all. And please note that we are recording today's session. With that, I would like to introduce our featured speaker, Holly Crane, Williams class of 2012. Holly is a coach and educator that's been working in the fitness and athletic industry for over a decade. Holly is the current assistant strength and conditioning coach at NYU. She holds a BA in Comparative Literature from Williams and an MS in Kinesiology from the University of Minnesota. And in addition to coaching, Holly also studies, teaches, writes, lives, breathes, thinks about athletics and fitness. She is particularly interested in the ways that cultural narratives about gender, bodies, and identity are created, reinforced, and really sometimes contested within these spaces. Holly's goal as an educator and as a practitioner is to help people understand the systems of power and inequality that operate in fitness and athletic contexts and the ways we can disrupt those systems. In 2019, she developed and taught a Williams Winter Study class called Bros Cardio Bunnies, Constructing Gender and Body in the Field and in the Gym and on the Field. I think this is the best title in the running for best title for Alumni Winter Study, certainly, and Winter Study broadly. And she taught that class again to students for Winter Study in 2022, so last year. We're really appreciative that Holly was willing to prepare a bite-sized 1-hour version of her course today, specifically designed for you, Williams alumni and friends. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Holly so we can get started.
Thank you so much, Layla. I'm going to go ahead and start to share my screen. And we're going to get started. Hello. Layla covered a lot of the introduction I was going to give about myself, so thank you so much. I already have a lot to pack into an hour, so we're going to try to be as efficient as possible. As Layla mentioned, I've taught this class twice. It's one of the things I'm most proud about is developing and teaching this class, and I'm very excited to bring a bite-sized version of it to you all today. So just a brief sort of overview here. Typically, the way that I teach this class at Williams is that it's a hybrid class, which means that the sort of half of the class actually is taking place in the LaSalle weight room, and I am teaching people how to weightlift, which I love as a personal trainer, practitioner, human. And the second half of the course is discussion based. So obviously we're not going to do the weightlifting portion today, unfortunately, but I just wanted to sort of let you know that the way that I typically break this course down is in 3 sections. The first is about the gender binary in sport and fitness. The second section is power, politics, and sporting bodies. The third section is sport, wellness, and the legacy of white supremacy. Frankly, that's too much for 1 month, and I try to shove it in there anyway, but it's definitely too much for an hour. So I'm gonna condense some stuff and emphasize, I'm gonna sort of take out some things and actually emphasize others, so that what we're going to cover mostly is actually the gender binary and its impact on sport and fitness, with a sort of emphasized focus on trans athletes and sport. I always teach this particular section, but I want to put more emphasis on it in this particular course, given the increased visibility that trans athletes have in American discourse today and over the last few years. We'll also touch briefly on sport, fitness, and politics. So very briefly about me. So at Williams, I'm Williams class of 2012. I sang in Euphoria, which is one of the a cappella groups on campus. I was a very active member of the theater community. I lived in Mission as a freshman. I don't know if people care about that anymore. I never did a sunrise hike. This is a thing that comes up. I never did it. And during the swine flu epidemic of 2009, I was the first person quarantined on Mount Hope, which I did not realize at the time would be a foreshadow of some very dark days to come. So shout out to anyone who had to live in a tiny room alone eating sort of individually plastic wrapped apples at Mount Hope. That was quite the time. Very relevant to this class is that in my 4 years at Williams, I never once set foot in the LaSalle weight room where I now teach a class. So how on earth did I get here? I sort of took a very roundabout journey that has led me to arrive at a place where I like to take my comparative literature background in sort of analysis and sort of seeking to understand the world through words. And I've sort of translated it into bodies. I moved to New York to become an actor, didn't like it, ended up getting into fitness. And it was through my experience as a personal trainer that I started to observe some patterns that troubled me, specifically with regards to women in the weight room. I noticed a sort of consistent concern among a lot of women about looking like someone else or trying to craft their bodies in this specific way to fit some sort of cultural ideal. I noticed this like strange difference in the way that I was treated as a woman personal trainer and my male colleagues. And it was just something that I really wanted to learn more about. So I got my master's degree in kinesiology and sort of in this very roundabout way ended up at NYU, where I am the strength and conditioning coach, which allows me to coach young athletes, which I love because I believe that our job as coaches is not just about sport, but is about preparing kids to be the best versions of themselves and to contribute within whatever field they choose. In addition to sort of my coaching, I am a competitive weightlifter. That is the middle photo that you see there. So basically what this means is that I spend more time in gyms than not in them. I'm either in them or I'm sleeping or eating, but most of the time I'm eating in gyms. It really all looks the same. I also, when I have time, I try to teach as much as I can about sort of the topics I'm going to cover today. I recently led a workshop for the New York State Association of Independent Schools Athletic Association on trans inclusion in high school athletics, which is really important to me. So, you know, as you can sort of see based on my background, I spend more times in gyms than not. And I truly believe that sport and fitness sport and fitness can have profound and long-lasting impacts on who we are and how we interact with the world. And I would like to give us more language to interact with sort of places in our culture that we don't spend a lot of time talking about. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do here is actually start with a poll, which, pardon me, y'all, I have to find it. Layla, can you help me out here?
You got.
I can't see the like chat box or anything. There we go. Okay. So first poll here is just, have you ever played sports before? Any age, any level, from like Pee-wee, whatever, when you were 3 to you went to the Olympics? I'm just going to kind of wait for responses to come through. Looks like they have. And can folks see this, the results of this poll now? There we go. Looks like we're sharing the results right now. So the reason I ask this question is I usually anticipate the answer, which is every single person here has played sports at some level, whether you play it now or not. Really, this just goes to show how much impact or how many of us are touched by sport in some way. So we're going to move on to the next poll, which is asking you how sport has impacted your life, whether you played it or not, and everyone has. But this one will take a little bit longer. Think a little bit about your answers here. Okay, this is fun and nice to see how much of a positive impact that sport has had on everyone here. As you can see, we have like mostly an extremely positive impact, which is great. And sometimes when I ask this question, I also get like a negative impact. And my point with this is sort of saying that sport plays a huge role in our personal and cultural consciousness. So how we've been shaped as children, whether it's relationships with our coaches, with our teammates, and sort of who we are today. So almost every person has some relationship to sport, whether it's bad or whether it's good. And so that is going to bring me to this next concept here that I want to talk about, which is a concept that was coined by a sports sociologist named Jay Coakley, who tells us, or rather sort of encapsulates this idea that sports are inherently pure and good, that sport builds character, and anyone who partakes in sport will be better for it. And we've all heard this idea in some way, whether it's through like sports movies or through media or something. And my question is that actually true, right? The reason behind this question, or even sort of thinking through this myth a little bit more, this sports myth, is that the impact of the idea that sports are inherently pure and good is that it implies that sport exists outside of a political or social framework, that sports and fitness simply are what they are. There's no need to question or challenge these pursuits because they're seen as like fundamentally separate from our lived experiences outside the gym or the sports field. And I believe that if you're here, you probably have an inkling that that's not true. And I certainly believe that this is not true at all. And the purpose of the course for me is to interrogate the many ways that sport and fitness are used to define and reinforce things like gender dynamics, power structures, class and racial differences, and many other very impactful constructs. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right into one of the first sort of concepts here. One of the most visible ways that sport and fitness impact our beliefs about our bodies and our identities and who we are is through the concept of the gender binary. And as you can sort of see on this slide here, the gender binary is the widely accepted myth that there are only two genders and that they are mutually exclusive and oppositional. The gender binary is a social construct, which means that it's not an objective reality. It's something that's sort of been built sort of slowly over time by our culture, but it's not based in truth. That said, it does have a very real impact on our lives. So it's a very important concept that while this thing is not real, it has a real impact. And so in order to dissect this myth a little bit, we have to understand some fundamental truths. The first one being that sex and gender are not the same thing, although they are widely conflated. Sex is a set of biological attributes, historically divided into male and female. However, we now know, or have known for a long time, that that's not exactly the truth. Sex is far more complicated than a simple like XX, XY chromosome. There are a number of different sex variations that exist. The existence of intersex people who have a different sort of variation in chromosomes or have different internal and external sex organs prove to us that sex itself is not a binary. So that's sort of the biological piece that it will come up a little bit later. And then there's the social piece, which is gender, which is sort of is made up of socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities that sort of contribute to a person's belief about who they are. So examples of genders are man, woman, transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, agender. The list goes on. There are many, many options here. And gender is fluid, which means that a person's gender and relationship to their gender can change over time. So there are a number of ways in which the gender binary is reinforced. And when I say reinforced, I mean sort of proven as true in sort of sport and fitness places. I've sort of listed out a couple here, and at some point I'm going to ask you to share some of your own thoughts on this. But we have muscularity, right? We have like very visible differences in muscles between sort of your more muscular men and women. This idea of muscles being something that distinguishes for us what a man and what a woman is. We have sort of different ways that fitness is marketed towards men and women. You can just see like very easily on this like Men's Health, Women's Health magazine, just how different the idea of health is for men and women. Again, even the fact that I'm talking about this from the perspective of men and women, we're completely leaving out non-binary people, people who don't conform to gender in this way. We have locker rooms, right? They're typically anywhere you go, you're really only seeing two locker rooms, men and women. Again, reinforcing the gender binary. Sports teams are divided by gender at a very young age. You have kids as young as 5 playing on gender segregated teams. Viewership in sports, that's a whole other sort of conversation, but we'll talk about it a little, which is that we see sort of consistently more viewership for men's sports than for women. And there are observable differences in athletic ability between women and men. And I will say that again, there are observable differences in athletic ability between women and men, which is not the same thing as saying that men are stronger than women. But we can see those differences. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that matters. So I'm going to ask you to sort of pop into the chat and let me know if there are other ways that you see the gender binary sort of operating or playing a role in sports and fitness, ways in which sort of this like strict division between men and women plays out in different sports or in the gym. And I'll take a second to sort of allow your brains to mull on that question. Yeah, so the kind of fitness attire that is for sale, absolutely. I mean, you can see it very clearly just in this sort of magazine here, but you can go, sometimes I even think about the options that are available for women versus men. If you go somewhere like there are entire stores that don't even carry men's clothing because it seems like it's athleisure has sort of taken over for women, where it's actually less about what you can do in the clothes and more about what you look like. Attendance, hi Mary, attendance in group classes. And so what I'm going to guess Mary is alluding to here is like if you have a yoga class at a gym or maybe a Pilates or a Zumba class, you see a much higher percentage of women in those classes. Whereas if you have maybe a more strength-based class or like a CrossFit class, you tend to see more men participating. While other people are sort of thinking on this question, I'll also talk about team names. Oh wait, we got a lot. Never mind. I don't want to say stuff. I want other people to say stuff. Yep. Okay. So Lisa says sports that are promoted for women to partake in are either elevated by the NCAA, for instance, stunt, cheer, tumbling. Absolutely. So this is called sport typing. So there's actually research that from the 70s about the way that certain sports are typed by gender, where like the graceful sports like cheer, like dance are more like gender appropriate for women. And then the more contact sports, rugby, football are more gender appropriate for men. I also see like stereotypes of who participates in an activity, exact same thing. Contact fighting sports are for men. at NYU, there is no wrestling team for women. We only have a men's wrestling team. Football, obviously, right? With very few schools offer football opportunities for women. The absence of mixed gender sports, there are so few. And even in mixed gender sports, such as gymnastics, right? Men compete in gymnastics. They're doing different things, right? So you have men are competing on the rings, the pommel horse, while women are doing floor, beam, etc. Let's see, the science offered to male versus female. So Michael here is pointing out to like the sort of using science to argue sort of that men are inherently stronger than women. And we're absolutely going to come back to that idea very soon. I see Title IX on here. I'm going to pop into Title IX, talk a little bit about Title IX in a second. Pay disparity, absolutely. We have the case of the women's national soccer team suing to be paid equally, given that they actually take in way more revenue than their male counterparts. I love it. Okay, great. So I'm going to move on from this because we could talk about it all day, but you are making my point very firmly, right? Which is that there are all sorts of ways in which we see sort of clear, I'll say proof, but like clear ways in which the gender binary is an organizing principle for sport and fitness. The last thing I'll say, which used to be in the little blurb about my class, is if anyone was at Williams 2012, like my year and before, and just put it in the chat, I'm so curious. Do you remember that the Upper LaSalle gym, the one with all the cardio equipment in it, used to be called the Estro Gym? If anyone remembers the term Estro Gym, please, yes. It kills me. Wow, y'all. Okay. So when I was teaching in 2021 or 2022, there were some students who hadn't heard of that. But it's actually one of the main reasons I sort of framed the course the way that I did. Because as someone who never set foot in the LaSalle weight room, I felt like I really only was allowed to go upstairs. So there's our final example there. Okay, thanks so much for all your sort of participation in here. It's wonderful. Okay, so the next, I'm going to transition here because I want to have as much time to talk about this topic as possible, which is anti-trans legislation and sport. This is the particularly insidious and harmful way that the gender binary is sort of reinforced in this context. So in the last 3 years, in particular, the amount of anti-trans legislation that's being proposed is sort of grown astronomically. And before I sort of go over some of the statistics here, it's important to remember that what we're talking about is not elite athletes. Right, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, has its own sort of set of guidelines. It's actually recently come out about how suggestions about how each sport federation should sort of include trans athletes. A lot of it is based on not banning people from competing based on gender identity or sex variations. Trans women have been competing in elite sports since the 70s, right? So it's not new. It's also important to note that they've been able to compete since the 70s, and we don't see a lot of trans women like dominating elite sport. What we're talking about here, though, is children as young as 5 and as old as 18, because most of these bills are targeting high schoolers. Some of them are targeting middle and elementary schools. So we're talking about kids. So just sort of some data here, 18 states currently ban trans participation in youth sport, 18, which means young children are not allowed to play sports. By February of last year, 27 states had already proposed fairness in sport bills. That's typically the language used. And already in 2023, 20 states have proposed anti-trans legislation. So this is a massive problem, and it's increasing. And I have in this little box here to the side, the language of Title IX, because one sort of particularly insidious, I'll use the word again, thing is that conservative lawmakers are currently using the language of Title IX to advance anti-trans legislation. Title IX is a civil rights bill. It is within the Civil Rights Act. And it is that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in any education program. And the reason why Title IX is associated with sport is because of that any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Sports play a huge role in that. Basically, this bill passed in 1972 finally gave women the same opportunities as men, and it is now today being used to exclude trans people from those same opportunities. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge the role of the law in this sort of context. So I'm going to spend, I could talk about this all day, but I want to spend a little bit of time getting into this concept of sort of trans athletes and advantage, because the argument that trans athletes should not be allowed to play sport is that they have an unfair biological advantage, that it is unfair to cis women for trans women to compete. And remember that we're only talking about trans women here. This conversation is not about trans men, right? We do not really talk about trans men when we talk about trans athletes. Trans men have far fewer barriers to competition. That doesn't mean those barriers don't exist. They certainly do, but they are not as many as trans women. And while I want to talk about this myth of advantage, it's important to acknowledge that advantage isn't really an argument that makes sense when we're talking about 10-year-olds, because biologically, if you line up a bunch of 10-year-olds of any gender, some look 4 and some look like 16. Or if you look at middle schoolers, the range of just like hormonal profiles is so vast that you couldn't separate it out by gender even if you wanted to. So this data, or there's some pieces of data here that have been pulled from a 2022 literature review of trans women athlete participation in elite sports. So I pulled out some of the main points here. So this is what we know, that biomedical factors related to puberty, so like your lung size, your bone density, the things that sort of grow in puberty, do not predict athletic performance. So how you go through puberty does not impact how you compete as an athlete. Social factors, on the other hand, like nutrition, training, access, greatly impact an athlete's performance. So biology doesn't matter as much as the social context in which you play your sport. Very importantly, testosterone levels do not predict athletic performance or athleticism. I want to get that on a t-shirt and just like walk around and wear it, because that's always the argument. Testosterone levels do not predict athletic performance or athleticism. They simply do not. All people, and to sort of further complicate the sort of hormone thing, all people have estrogen and testosterone at varying levels. And the distribution of testosterone levels between elite cis men and elite cis women overlaps, which means that there are some cis women with higher levels of testosterone than some cis men, right? We are not talking about a binary here. We simply are not. So the current discourse really doesn't see, I think, I can't remember who put science in the chat, but like, here's the science without quotation marks. And yet the current discourse constantly privileges biology, right? Oh, it's biology. Oh, it's science. And here we are saying like, oh, it's not. And sometimes that argument doesn't seem to work. So we're going to get into some other stuff here. I want to flesh out the factors that impact sports performance a little bit more. So we have social factors, which I talked about. So we've got money, by the way, like, I don't know, downhill skiing, like that sport is so expensive. Do you have access to coaching? Do you have access to facilities, to nutrition, to all of these different things? Social support. Are you a woman boxer who grew up in a home where you were sort of taught that boxing wasn't feminine? That will absolutely impact how you perform as an athlete. Access to equipment, facilities, where do you live? Do you live rurally? Do you live like in an urban area? I put sexual harassment on here because being consistently sexually harassed is going to impact your sports performance. And I'll put a brief note that if you haven't seen it, everyone should watch Athlete A on Netflix about sort of Larry Nassar. I talk a lot about this in the longer course, but that documentary really leans into how much that sort of context can impact sports performance, among many other things. Biases, microaggressions, support staff, these are all things that have nothing to do with biology and yet really impact the way we perform as athletes. There are also a number of biological factors that impact sports performance, like height, right? Like look at a Division I basketball team. They're all pretty tall. That doesn't mean that all tall people are good at basketball or that all short people are bad at basketball, but generally height helps. All right. We have Michael Phelps, who has reduced lactic acid production, which is a more complicated way of saying the man doesn't really get that tired. His muscles don't burn in the same way that other people's do. So we also have people who have sort of various genetic sort of mutations that make them taller, acromegaly, Marfan syndrome. And there's genetic mutations that cause increased O2 capacity. Oh, like genes are wild. Like humans have so much variability. But naturally occurring hormonal variations that many intersex individuals have are not acceptable in sport. And I'm going to very briefly talk about the case of Caster Semenya, who is pictured here. And I'm going to do this fast because I'm trying to pack it a lot in here. Caster Semenya is a sprinter from South Africa. Following her victory in the 800-meter sprint in the 2009 World Championships, she was forced to undergo sex testing because questions were raised about her sex, meaning people saw her and decided that she didn't look like a woman. There's a lot to do with race here. Right? Caster Semenya is from South Africa. She's a dark-skinned Black woman who does not have the typical sort of features associated with Western white beauty. Basically, the testing proved that Caster Semenya is intersex and has naturally elevated testosterone levels. She was banned from competition the next year, allowed to compete again like soon after that, then again banned in 2019 after there was a rule change within the sport federation. And basically was not allowed to compete in her sport for years. So why is it that we celebrate certain genetic differences, a la Michael Phelps, and police and punish others? And the answer to that question often comes down to the gender binary, because one of those advantages, the lactic acid production, doesn't challenge the idea that gender is binary, and the other does. The level playing field idea comes up a lot, right? That's when we talk about sort of not allowing trans athletes in sport, the league got to level the playing field. And my sort of question here is like, is that even a thing? Is that even possible? This idea of a level playing field is sort of the same language as what we refer to as meritocracy, right? The idea in athletics, meritocracy is the idea that athletic success, power, and dominance comes purely from talent and hard work, that no one has an inherent advantage over anyone else. But we can see that there are all sorts of ways where people can have advantages, social, biological, all of these things. It doesn't make anyone a better or worse person. We're just acknowledging that the playing field isn't level, that meritocracy doesn't really exist. So I want to go back to our sort of conversation, or this idea of banning trans women as if it's not really about leveling the playing field, right? Because fairness doesn't really work that way. What exactly are we protecting cis women from by not allowing trans athletes to compete? And I'm gonna take a second, and if anyone wants to throw an answer into the chat of what exactly are we protecting women from by not allowing trans women to compete in sport? And this is a complicated question, but if anyone has ideas, throw it in the chat, and otherwise I'll kind of keep going here. I keep losing the chat. I found it. It's okay if there's no answer here because it's confusing, right? It's confusing when you think about it. And if you think of something, throw it in the chat, but I'm gonna go ahead and play a little sort of theoretical experiment here, which is that let's assume that all trans women are superior athletes who dominate competition. We know that's not true. Trans women have been able to compete since the 70s. They don't dominate, yada, yada. Even though there are some examples of trans women who do, the vast majority of them don't. Then what are we, if that's true, trans women dominate competition, what are we protecting women from? Because it seems like maybe we're protecting them from like losing, which is very confusing to me because isn't that what sport is all about? Yeah. So that's what Kevin says, like losing, like, is it like, are women just not supposed to lose to someone who is perceived as biologically male, which is a pejorative term and inaccurate. A trans woman is not biologically male. I bring this up because it's important to point that out. Like, what are we? That's not how sports work. We're protecting them from what? Like their egos, our egos being bruised. I'm an athlete, and I find that really offensive, right? So it's important to sort of poke holes into this argument. Take the argument all the way out. What are we actually protecting them from? Oh, you're protecting them from losing. That doesn't actually make sense. So then, if we're not protecting women, and I would argue that we're not, I'm reading the chat right now, the overwhelming majority of sports competitors are not doing it at the highest level of competition. Right. So like, take out the elites. What are we protecting our children from? Right? Like losing a game of t-ball? I don't understand. So it seems that what we are maybe protecting here are not women at all, but actually is the idea that gender binary is real. What we are protecting is our stake in this myth, because if that myth falls apart, right? If the myth that we have men and women, and that's just how it is, and those are your roles in society, if that falls apart, the world looks scary for a lot of people. It looks confusing and unknown, and you don't know who you are or where you fit. So whenever you hear that language, protecting, I encourage you all to think like, protecting whom? Protecting how? What is it that we have a stake in, and what are we afraid of losing? Okay, so there's so much more to be said on this topic, and there's room to discuss more in the question and answer. So if you have some questions on this, please throw them in the Q&A, and I'll get to it at the end if I have time. But I do want to try to transition for the sake of time into a slightly different realm, where we also hear the this refrain of like the level playing field, or this idea of meritocracy. This is politics, right? Because meritocracy is the very cornerstone of the American dream, right? If you work hard, you will succeed, and that's that. So it is not a coincidence that sport mirrors sort of American values. That is not a coincidence, right? Football is the American sport, and the American sport is football. And I do believe that these things are like, this is intentional, okay? And sort of before I get into some of this, I just want to say that often the refrain is that sports are apolitical, right? We heard it a lot when during 2020, when Colin Kaepernick was protesting during the national anthem, people were saying, leave politics out of football. There was the woman who sort of notoriously told LeBron James to shut up and dribble. This idea that athletes shouldn't be political at all. That's really only applies to very specific times when athletes are being political in ways that the stakeholders don't want them to be. So when I talk about politics, what I mean here is the allocation of resources and values in society. I don't mean Democrat and Republican. I mean the dominant cultural ideologies that uplift some and suppress and erase others. So we see this happen in sport and fitness all the time, despite the messaging being that sports aren't political, that they exist just for entertainment, and that this is something that we should take for granted. So I'm sort of noticing the time here, and I was going to sort of ask people to contribute here, but instead I'll just sort of zoom on through here, which is that politics shows up in sport and fitness in a number of ways. We talk about legislating trans athletes, right? That is a very political move, obviously. We play the national anthem before like every game ever. That's political. It simply is, right? It's referencing sort of this country and pride within it, which is a political choice. In the same way that choosing to not stand for that anthem is a political choice. There's a lot of fitness marketing around the American flag, just like a lot. Start to pay attention to the amount of times American flags show up in gyms. Speaking of gyms, COVID and masks and vaccines, and the ways in which various gym owners resisted mask and vaccine regulations. So sort of there is a fair amount of data that indicates that sport has played an increasing role in the alt-right agenda and white backlash politics, which we can see in the example of Colin Kaepernick, which we can see sort of in the sort of gym mask anti-vaxxer sort of conversation that was going on. So this is something that it plays a very real role in sports and fitness. Go. It's not a coincidence, right? None of this is a coincidence. And I want us to have time to talk more about this in the Q&A section. But I did also want to zoom into fitness specifically, because I know I spent a lot of time talking about sport. I remember in 2020 when all these fitness influencers on Instagram were like, keep politics out of fitness. But like, to my point, there's so many reasons why politics plays a role in fitness all the time. The fitness industry really helps contribute to the idea that healthcare is the responsibility of the individual and not the duty of the state. We could talk about this for days, but the idea that the American healthcare system as putting the onus of care on the individual and taking it away from the system that is designed to care for you. Fitness really contributes to that idea. It brings this whole new meaning to the idea of like health is wealth, because really it's the other way around. Like wealth is health. If you are not wealthy, you have way less access to health. Gyms, fitness play a huge role in that. Fitness has an inclusion problem. The fitness industry is rampant with anti-fat bias, ableism. It's accessible to only folks who live in certain areas, who have certain means. It's sort of a constant problem. And it also sort of, you can see the relationship between fitness and capitalism, right? Health and fitness at this point in our culture is something that you can buy. You can like buy these like products. Like Gwyneth Paltrow has created an entire empire based on the idea that you can like buy youth or health in like a little bottle named something weird, If anyone here is a podcast person, I highly recommend the podcast Maintenance Phase, which talks a lot about healthism and sort of the evils of that concept. There's a weird amount of military imagery in fitness. I talked about sort of the American flags and gyms, but we see this in fitness a lot. There's these sort of like military-based competitions. Tough Mudder, the civilian military combine is one of them. In CrossFit, you have something called a hero WOD or workout of the day, which there are these workouts that are named after people who have died in combat. Which is fundamentally a little strange because we are talking about a gym sort of paying homage to military heroes in a very specific sort of glorifying way. Camo gear, so much camo. Go to any fitness store, it's like camo everything, which I just find funny because like, where are you wearing it that you're camouflaged? American flags everywhere. And then, visibility, representation. You can do the little trick of like Googling fit woman and seeing the images that come up, and they're all skinny white women almost entirely or white adjacent. So this is my like very rapid fire sort of examples of the ways in which politics show up in these spaces, because we are talking, right? Fitness and sport are inherently political because we're dealing with bodies, space, and power. And when you put bodies who have different levels of power in a space, you end up with some sort of paradigm, some sort of dynamic that is political in nature. We're dealing in contexts where certain people are allowed to participate and others are not. Where strong power dynamics exist between coach and athlete, owner, player, gym manager, trainer. And if we don't consider the ways these power dynamics play out or think critically about what goes on in these spaces, we're perpetuating the same sort of cultural myths that do harm to a lot of people. So, man, I think I'm all right. Yeah, excellent. We have 14 minutes for questions. So sort of my final thoughts here are really more or less what I just said, that I want us to interrogate the ideas and places in our culture that are often taken for granted. are seen as simple and uncomplicated. To me, that looks like asking more questions than finding answers, unfortunately. Who is controlling this narrative? Who are we centering? Who are we leaving out? Who has power here and who does not? And I find that if you ask these questions, whenever you are in a fitness or sort of athletic space, well, people might get annoyed at you. I will admit the Super Bowl is coming up. I encourage you to all be annoying about it. But people will also think about things that they've never really thought before. Okay, I'm sweating. Man. Okay, questions. We did it. We're getting to the question part. So I'm gonna hop on the Q&A section here and start to answer questions. I'm gonna take a beat, throw any questions that you have on there. I'm also gonna look through the chat because I saw some stuff come up there. Simple question, are there links to videos, slides, or other material? Absolutely. I can answer that live. Great. Absolutely, there are links. I will send some stuff to Layla and perhaps she can send it out. But however we work that out, I will absolutely provide some follow-up resources here. Let's see the name. Okay. The name of the podcast I recommended, and I think I can put this in the chat to everyone right now, is Maintenance Phase. It's amazing, funny, smart, really, really fantastic. I'm going to look through. Okay, Layla's going to help us out with that. Yeah, okay. So I see Kate is bringing up this idea that there's a concern about kids getting into colleges based on this idea of losing to trans athletes. Yes, I've definitely heard that in the discourse. I don't think it's, oh, you know what? Yes, because of scholarships. One of the arguments that comes up in this discourse a lot is I'm going to lose out to my scholarship. The irony of that to me is Title IX again, is that like the whole point of Title IX was to provide women with the scholarship opportunities that men had. So I struggle with that as someone who cares about people. And also that a lot of times we're talking about women who were given opportunities by the law. Right? So now we're talking about using the law to take opportunities away from people. And because we don't have good data on the amount of trans people who participate in sport. We just don't. Partially because there's not a lot of research on trans people in sport. Partially because that might be asking people to out themselves. So there's a lot of reasons. And while there are a lot more sort of trans people who are comfortable being themselves today, we know that the numbers are not astronomical. Frankly, a lot of us would like there to be more trans people who feel comfortable playing sport, but we're not talking about giving out scholarships by the boatload. So like with all these arguments, I want to try to peel the layers back to the heart of it, which is how many scholarships are we talking about? What are you really losing out? Thank you for that question, Kate. I'm reading a question in my head here. Okay, I'm gonna answer this. So Alicia's talking about person who had gender reassignment or gender affirmation surgery from male to female. She was a professional tennis player. And Alicia, I think I know who you're talking about, and my brain is not operating right now. And yeah, you bring up a really good point, which is like, we're still confused about this stuff, right? We still don't totally know how to talk about it. I think sometimes people are afraid of saying the wrong thing, which is why I try to teach the class that I do, because assuming that you are willing to engage in the conversation, you're willing to ask questions, then I want to help you think more about them. Probably you're going to end up with more questions than answers, like I said. But yes, we have had sort of athletes transition in their career age, for many, many years ago, and we have it happening today. What is new is conservative lawmakers using trans athletes in sport to further a political agenda. And that is new and scary. Okay, so this question here is, how do you respond to someone who says testosterone confers an advantage to a trans woman, someone who's assigned male at birth? I'm gonna put this up live because I want people to see this. Even if someone is taking hormones to fall within typical female levels. Yeah, okay. So what Sarah's asking about here is this idea that someone who went through puberty, right? Someone who went through puberty, went through as like male puberty, not a thing, but and basically accrued all the advantages that come with having a male body, and then they transition and are competing with women. So I'm gonna go back here to this, sorry, slide, which is that biomedical factors related to puberty do not predict athletic performance. So there is data that tells us that how you went through puberty doesn't actually impact athletic performance in the way that a lot of people think. I also would argue here that, again, plenty of cis women have had different opportunities forever, right? You could join a lacrosse team, like you might play lacrosse in college, and there's a woman who walked onto the team who just, for whatever reason, I don't know, is like extremely good at lacrosse but never played it. Is she is she at a disadvantage from girls who had a private lacrosse coach when they were 5? I think one of the ways you answer this question is, okay, what are other areas in which we see people who've had advantage forever, and why aren't we policing them, right? What about the athletes who just have way more money? They have more of an advantage. So that's how I'm going to answer that question. Okay. All right, let's see. So Mary's asking, pain and injury are a big part of the journey for fitness and athleticism. Absolutely. Are there gendered assumptions about pain? I love this question, Mary, and instantly what I think about is racial assumptions about pain. There's a lot of sort of race bias in medicine about the ways in which like Black women in particular feel pain. Yes, though the short answer is yes. And as someone who works in athletics, I see a lot of sort of assumptions about men's tolerance for pain. This is actually where I'll talk about the disadvantages that men face in sport, which is I think that a lot of boys grow up believing that injuries are their fault and that they should push through pain, which leads them to crippling injuries later in their lives, and generally an idea that their own body can fail them. So yeah, that's one way in which I'll say I think that assumptions about the gender binary and masculinity harm men as well as women and any other gender. Okay, I think this is a good question. So there are many social, racial, political, and other issues in sports. Does your focus on trans athletes undercut the broader base progress that needs to be made? No, I don't believe so, because I believe that even if we're talking about a small population, what we are talking about is inclusion and access, which impacts every single other area. Right? So if we talk about inclusion for trans athletes, we are also talking about inclusion and access and resources for women, right? We are talking about, we're having a conversation about a admittedly small sort of subclass of people who are the most subjugated and excluded in sport. So if we include them, then does it not follow that we are including other people? We're having a broader conversation about the social implications of sport, which touches on the impact of let's talk about race in sport, right? If we're talking about, there's all sorts of things here let's talk about the NFL, right? Mostly Black players, mostly white owners, right? If you're willing to engage with the fact that sport in and of itself, right, can be problematic, you're willing to talk about that too. Right. So when we talk about this small subset, we are actually hitting on all sorts of ways in which sport sort of can be both a vehicle for inclusion and a vehicle for exclusion. And I'll say that this is my particular hill that I will die on, and that there are plenty of other hills that I encourage other people to choose. Okay. I'm looking at the clock. I have 3 minutes. All right. Athleisure. Oh gosh, I would love to talk more about my thoughts on athleisure as it relates to gender, wealth, consumerism. Here's just a great example of the ways in which we market fitness as something that you look like, versus and health, right? And that idea is so weird to me, because health and fitness is something that's like fundamentally internal, right? We're talking about like your like resting heart rate, which like your clothes can't tell me anything about. I think here, however, and I'll sort of flip sides here, is that one thing with athleisure that we've seen a lot of is lack of access to larger bodies. And now there's a number of companies, of athleisure companies, that market much larger sizes. And here's somewhere where I see sort of athleisure marketing, fashion and fitness to be something that is inclusive rather than exclusive. So there's like two sides to that. You guys, you're asking such great questions. Okay, what action can we as amateur athletes, gym goers, sports fans take to disrupt these systems of power and inequality? I believe that it is being willing to have these conversations anywhere. Being willing to engage. I had someone say to me once, what did he say? We were talking about trans athletes, and he said something like, well, if I want to identify as a red pepper, what's stopping me? Right? We were talking about gender and people identifying as they please. And I could have gotten really offended by that question. And the fact is, I'm a cis woman and it's much easier for me not to. But I chose not to because, and it sort of, we ended up having this like really wonderful conversation about gender and inclusion. And, you know, I don't know how much his mind was changed, but I believe in the context of our conversation, he wasn't made to feel stupid for his question. And I think like as a cis woman in this space, that's my job, is to help people not feel stupid for asking questions and engaging in conversation, even if you disagree with them, assuming that they are not saying harmful stuff. Okay, I think that's Layla's clue to me that I need to shut up now.
No, not that you need to shush at all. But to thank you for a really terrific hour. There is a long list of questions still in the Q&A. Holly, and everyone that's entered a question, I've copied them down. We'll share them with Holly. And if you have a name attached, I'm sure Holly will be glad to either get back to you or pass along some answers. But thank you to everyone that engaged in today's session. We're really, really grateful that you took the time to show up and spend time learning. And thank you so much to Holly for everything you're doing. I think this is the perfect example of knowledge being power, and a great way to help disrupt some of these systems is just kind of understanding and being able to talk knowledgeably. And I know I learned a lot today, and our audience did as well. So thank you so much. I'm also going to make a quick plug, because this is the last of our alumni winner study sessions for January. We'll come back next January with more, but this is the final one. We do have, for those that are just loving these intellectual engagement opportunities, we will be live streaming from Claiming Williams. There will be 2 keynotes. The one I want to highlight is an author talk with Amani Perry. She'll be talking about her award-winning book, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. So if you're able to tune in, I hope you can. I'm going to put in the chat a link there. And thank you so much. We're just really appreciative. And a lot of love for you in the chat here, Holly. Thank you for everything you're doing. And I know the students are really grateful to be learning directly from you. So thanks all.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your attention and questions.
Yeah. Everyone, take good care. Yes, and recordings will be made available, Robert. So we'll get those uploaded into the college's YouTube channel, and we'll send them around to everyone that registered, as well as post them on social and in EPHS. So you can find the content there. All right, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you on the other side. Take care.